This session will take about 90 minutes. We will listen to the speakers. Each speaker will present a 15-minute paper, and then we will have a Q&A. As you might have read, this session is about cyberactivism and journalism. We will start with Aline Sara. She will talk about digital activism for women's rights in the Arab world. Aline is a journalist and researcher at USA. Please, Aline, you may start.
Yes, so just wanted to mention that I'm also Lebanese, so I think that also has an effect on my interests and my research. So first of all, thank you very much for the organizers, to the organizers of the conference for having me. It's very humbling to be up here in the presence of such inspiring women. So the focus of my work is on the internet and especially digital media and digital activism and how it can help women forward their engagements and their causes in the region. So I'd like to open with this photo. Just a show of hands, who has seen this image already? Just curious. Okay, so... So a brief overview, as I mentioned, I'm focusing on the role of the internet, which we all know has revolutionized communication today, bringing unprecedented speed, ease, and access to information and communication, as well on a large scale. So the paper explores how the phenomenon of the internet, and especially digital media, has worked in favor of Arab women. I have a very practical approach to things in general. I'm not an academic, so I like to study what makes a movement, a cause, yield a result. So that is kind of the optic with this paper and this research. So I will first have a very brief theoretical overview focused on a theory that was exposed in Fannebrook's research, which is tackling the interactivity, awareness, and mobilization elements of online social movements. Then I'll look at a few case studies, only a few, obviously for time purposes. I'll briefly mention the limitations that the internet brings as well, and conclude. So with regards to interactivity, digital media fosters debate, exchange of ideas, fast transmission, and with an easier access to bypassing censorship and government control. It also breaks down international and cultural barriers and helps form global and/or mass alliances, and it gives birth to new platforms such as crowd mapping, which I'm sure several of you are familiar with, which has this very highly visual and interactive nature and can help activism. So how does digital media help raise awareness? So today now we are seeing via digital media an upsurge in citizen journalism. So this is very different from the traditional media, which can often be state-controlled. So we as citizens partake in the news-making and propagating of this news. This lets marginalized communities be more represented. It also gives a voice to the fearful, to the voiceless. And it creates this third virtual space which does not follow traditional customs and laws. It is also key for Arab women with respect to changing the discussion around very taboo issues. So the internet has helped bring certain discussions from the private to the public sphere. So the third element, which is probably the most tricky, is moving from the virtual to the physical space. That being said, I will stay on the optimist side and say that the internet aids in recruitment, organization, calling to action, especially through social media networks. And again, the organization takes place in this third space, which can frequently be anonymous. So this is also very critical. So the first case I will be looking at is the Women to Drive campaign. So following the hype of the Arab uprisings, Manal al-Sharif from Saudi Arabia took to the wheel and drove and filmed herself, posted it on YouTube as part of the Women to Drive campaign. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. So with this campaign, there was a focus on the online activity. There was a Facebook group that was created, which has about 18,000 followers. She was also subsequently jailed, and why I mention this is that it's kind of amusing to see that when she was jailed, it generated even more attention to her cause, obviously, and even more buzz on the internet. So there was a cascade of discussion around this. Cartoonist videos, I'm sure some of you know Carlos Latouf, very known cartoonist. This also generated major international coverage in traditional media as well. She eventually went on to get internationally recognized with awards. And although we did not see a legal change in 2013, there was a discussion by Saudi authorities to address a possible change to the ban and consideration of letting women drive during very specific hours. So the discussion is the kind of final point that I'm trying to highlight. And also, this is not the first time that a woman films herself, puts it on YouTube while she's driving. But in 2007, when this happened, it did not have a Facebook page. And it was also pre-Arab uprising. So I think that's an interesting nuance to look into. The second case I am looking into is the Rest in Peace Amina campaign. In 2012, Amina Filali committed suicide as a result of, complete misery because she was forced to marry her rapist and live with him. So this was propagated online, so there was a very active online reaction. There was also a traditional and non-traditional reaction, as well as local and international coverage, which I believe was, again, bolstered by the social media aspect. In addition to the online component, the civil society in Morocco, which we have discussed already, is very, very active, had made calls to mobilization. A Facebook page, We Are All Amina Filali, was created, inspired by the We Are All Khalid Said famous page from the Egyptian uprising. There was also avaz.org, which is an international NGO that took on the cause via the internet with its online petition that garnered over 800,000 signatures. I believe I made the opposite sign there. Sorry about that. A documentary on her story was produced as well and marketed on social media. So combined with the mobilization on the grounds, we actually had a legislative change. In 2014, Morocco's parliament unanimously votes in favor of repealing Article 475, which included the loophole that enabled the rapist to marry her. The photo is a call to action, so I just thought I'd include that as well. This is a particular case. It's not itself a social campaign, but I think it's very interesting. Mona El-Tahawi is a prominent Arab-American, Egyptian to be specific, journalist. In 2012, she was sexually assaulted by Egypt's army during a protest in Tahrir Square. Immediately after her release, she described in great detail what had happened to her. So this example, 5 or 6 surrounded me, groped and prodded my breasts, grabbed my genital area, and I lost count how many hands tried to get into my trousers. What I think is very interesting to look at here is the live component of her tweeting, very close to the incident, in a very crude, unaltered way that is also addressing a traditionally taboo topic in the Middle East region. The fact that she is Arab and American gives her an increased influence and adds to the dimension of what had happened to her. She has 218,000 followers. So if you just think of what this means when this type of information is just kind of divulged like that to everyone out in the open, and there's no way for the Egyptian authorities to control this, censor this in any ways. I'm just mentioning 2 other campaigns that are focused on sexual harassment and very grounded in the online platform, which is the Adventures of Salwa, which originated here in Lebanon. And it's about creating a space as well via the virtual realm to discuss, exchange ideas, testify on the taboo topic. Harass Map, which has been mentioned a few times in the panels before, again, which interestingly also combines on and offline action, which I think is very important to highlight the combination of both the online and the offline activity. So what I see from these different campaigns targeted at sexual harassment is the general heightened awareness around a topic which is traditionally taboo, and bringing this discussion from the private to the public sphere. And I think it's interesting to observe how much harassment in Egypt specifically is present in international media today, and how that pressures also local authorities within Egypt. So just for me, something I noticed was on Election Day in 2012 in New York, the cover of the New York Times featured a story on sexual harassment, so on the A page of the front page. Another crowd mapping focused project is the Women Under Siege project. Within this project, I was particularly interested in the Syria crowd mapping. So this is a outlet for women who have suffered from rape and sexual violence to come and submit a report in which they can detail the location, what has happened to them. Of course, there is the fact that they need to have access to the internet, so I recognize that's a limiting factor. But this is a project that is not only focused on Syria, but on a number of countries. It furthers the discussion around rape as a war weapon, and also helps forward research on the topic. And again, it enables victims to submit anonymous reports on issues that are very frequently difficult to address and taboo. So the downside of the internet, I think, is very important to raise. I think that the first cases paint a very optimistic picture, but I believe that today also the internet is a source of many other problems and challenges. One first thing is, just as we have certain campaigns that we feel forward women's rights, there are equally important campaigns that might have different views. I came across an interesting campaign based in the UAE criticizing the kind of very, the lack of conservative garment in public. So it is, so here I've listed it right here. Another problem with online activism in the digital sphere is you risk preaching the choir. People will visit pages, engage in activities that they are already interested in. And so we need to find new means of actually breaking this, this circle and propagating our messages to other audiences, the ones that we want to bring on board for a given cause. There is also the famous debate around slacktivism, which combines the term of slacking and activism. So it's been frequently raised as, what does an online petition do? People just sit behind the screen and just sign an online petition. They click Facebook and like a photo. Is that really bringing anything? And it gives them the illusion of actually being active. So it's also important to find ways of making sure this doesn't take place. Obviously, not everyone has access to the internet. It remains a minority of people. However, I believe that the people who have access to the internet can act in a critical way, which can then cascade. And that is what we saw, for example, with the Egyptian uprising. Finally, there is a phenomenon of acute digital repression, which is quite chilling and frightening for those who are following the discussions on Edward Snowden, the NSA. It's a big problem, although we have had a small victory as of June 1st. But this is extremely present in the Arab world, and especially in the Gulf. Bahrain is one of the most striking examples. They've had a very severe clampdown on digital activism and their activists, and they have very impressive technologies of using the internet to track down activists, locate them, and then find them, incarcerate them, and repress them. So finally, I hope that my case has demonstrated how interactivity awareness and mobilization are facilitated by the internet and digital media. I think this is a rising field that we must continue and constantly study to ensure that we're maximizing this tool and avoiding its shortcomings. And I think it is especially helpful in the Arab world on issues related to women that are, I think, strongly suffering from the issues related to honor, shame, taboo. And the risks are present, but I think there are ways of coping with the challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me quickly say thank yous, particularly to my good friend Carol Mann for inviting me, to everybody involved in the organization for a fascinating event, and no one's mentioned to the interpreters. I hope I won't give you a really hard time. You've done a phenomenal job, so thank you. And to a really active audience. I've written down, already there's so much said, but now we're opening up new spaces. And we had a quick interchange. I'm going to do what you've done, but just in the other way round. And perhaps the echoes between us are also a function of the still limited amount of activity that there is. So we all are focusing on similar issues, you know, and similar dynamics. I think it's exciting and important to actually have a panel on cyberactivism and journalism included here. It's obvious that cyberspace is a new territory on which global conflicts are going to be fought. It's already prefigured in the Iraq War and increasingly in Afghanistan with drones. It's evident in cyber attacks against enemy targets, including, I think, most revealingly, the American-Israeli viruses, Stuxnet, Dooku, and Flame, which actually managed to take out material parts of Iranian installations. So it's a very vivid example of how the virtual, online, and the material embodied. And of course, that binary doesn't work because we're also embodied when we're online, and the online depends on a whole set of international cables and switches and its material. So we don't have a language for this different space, I would suggest. But I'm saying cyberspace is clearly an area of conflict. It seems last week the Chinese probably hacked into US government installations. And of course, as has already been mentioned, the Snowden revelations, WikiLeaks before that, have shown just how much surveillance there is being conducted by so-called democratic governments. So cyberspace includes massive governmental surveillance and control, and all our online activity needs to be conducted with privacy and safety uppermost in our minds. But it's clearly also, as we just heard, and there have been intimations through the few days, an important site, and increasingly so, of national political struggles in many countries and transnationally. It's one way, perhaps, of reinvigorating and creating new transnational networks. And if the region, as we've heard again so powerfully and tragically, is engulfed with massive material conflict and around wealth, power, territory, and the bodies of women, there's also a huge contest going on around discourses, visions, imaginaries of a world as different and a world of possibilities. So I think that women are increasingly important, and I do focus on women. I mean, I take all the arguments about gender being a set of power relations. I've cut out all my sort of conceptual stuff because I think it's been well established here, but I am going to focus mainly on women's activity. I think women are increasingly important artisans of meaning, defining our own subject positions, defining our political imaginaries, summoning others to join with us. Old media offered some opportunities, and I think we're going to hear about some old media. I like this. Old media, traditional media, legacy media. They haven't gone away. And again, you've already brought the old and the new, very well together. So I think this is a very important and relevant topic for the conference. Cliches around the Arab Springs predominate on the internet and in an awful lot of westernized, which I don't escape, but westernized academic work. The tropes, the synecdoches of Facebook revolution, Twitter revolution. Clearly, these new technologies have played a role from Iran in 2009 to Arab Springs now, but they were built on previously existing struggles, forms of organization, labor organizations, student organizations, women's organizations. But of course, at the same time, I think I do want to adopt a sort of soft technology position. This equipment, this infrastructure, and the mobile, I don't have one in my hand, the mobile phone, do you remember the moment you first got the mobile phone? I mean, I vividly do. My goodness, what can it do? It's an incredible technology. So I think one of the things that is happening, and again, we started this conference, and Aline just alluded to it, with the idea of borders shifting. So we're shifting both from very local context of political struggle through the nation state to building transnational networks. We're also increasingly blurring the line between the public and the private. And I think that is also then inviting us to think about a new definition, perhaps a new sphere of what we consider the political. And who I like very much in terms of thinking about this is Chantal Mouffe, who says the realm of the social are sedimented social practices that we take for granted, that have become naturalized, that are repetitive and part of our habitus of everyday life. And once we, and particularly once women, start bringing those issues which have been taboo subjects, silenced, not discussed, once those are brought into the public domain, we are extending the sphere of the political. And I just have a sense in the conference that the political's been all too simply and only formal democracy, parties, voting, elections and representation, all of which is vitally important. But we also, and we've had plenty of examples here of real struggle to redefine the political and to get women educated, empowered, mobilized, and active in actually speaking out their stories. I've got lots of data about the about the inequalities of access and development across the region. It's a hugely complex region, and even our language here has shifted between the Arab world, MENA, Muslim majority societies. I would say, as an academic, our language is always kind of failing us. The MENA scores the lowest in economic participation and political empowerment, and the second lowest for educational attainment across the regions. And if we're looking at social media and internet activity in particular, one argument is, of course, that all this activity is actually comparatively new in the region. Only a third of adults in Qatar, for example, have signed up. A third of adults in Qatar signed up for access just in the last year. Internet access is nascent in Jordan, Tunisia, and Egypt. This is all very new. But the spread of mobile telephony, especially, is improving general access to the internet, and particularly for women. If you try and find data about women's access, there's very little data about internet development and access across the region. There's minimal information that pertains to women, which is interesting. This is a new field, and gender and women's access has actually not yet been taken seriously at all. The most recent Arab World Online 2014 report, quote, social media in the Arab world is dominated by young men under 30, with only 1 in 3 social media users in the region being a woman. And I think that leads to an important argument that hasn't been much developed as yet, which is perhaps digital access and digital activism is inviting a new, younger generation of men and women, but let's say particularly women here, to become political. So I think there really is a very interesting gender shift, and I wonder how our discussions will connect with Val's interesting discussion about prior social movements and what the dialogue will be between new movements and old. I'm going to make 6 incredibly quick and obvious points, but sometimes I think the obvious just needs to be said. Even at an anecdotal level, there's a plethora of digital activity by women across the region. The broad-based social mobilizations of 2010-11 brought many in, and others have been active since. Women are Catholic, to use an interesting descriptor in this particular environment, Catholic about the platforms and modalities that they're using. Some blog, some take photographs, some graffiti walls, some tweet. There's no obvious dominance of one social platform or one form of digital engagement. Web pages, websites, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Viber, all of these create the constellation of new possible areas of activity. Publications, Aline mentioned citizen journalism. Another interesting development, I think, is the rise of what people are calling the commentariat, where women, again, play a very important role. One can think about Jadaliya, Arabic and English. I just, in the last couple of weeks, and I don't know if anybody in the audience is part of this, received the publication Cole, a journal about body and gender coming out of Lebanon with a very strong online presence. So there's a lot going on. My second point, much of the online activity actually has a national origin and focus. There's considerable activity in particular to Egypt, Iran, Tunisia, and much is conducted in regional languages, Arabic, Persian, Turkish. We haven't talked about the difficulties of crossing language barriers. It's quite hard to find cross-regional influences and cross-regional campaigns. Often it's to the international media writ large, or perhaps, of course, people talking to their particular diasporas, wherever the diaspora is located. Third, and again it echoes Aline, as elsewhere, the online environment can amplify individual voices who can make a difference. We know about Wael Ghanim in Cairo, but actually Asmana Mahfouz, of course, worked with him in Cairo and produced a lot of online video. Zainab Al-Kawaja was active in Bahrain under the Angry Arabia Twitter handle. Mona Saif, again, tweeting no to military trials for civilians. There are Saudi bloggers, there are Iraqi Kurdish Facebook activists. I've got lots of examples from Tunis, Tunisian girl, and Olfa Riahi, who blogged the biggest, as I understand it, post-revolutionary Tunis story known as Sheraton Gate, and helped to perhaps shift opinion against the sort of growing Islamist and sort of beyond Anada positions. Fourth, it's evident that women's bodies are the focus of greatest social and cultural concern. Whether wrapped or not in the street, whether visible or not in television and film, female embodiment, as we've heard over and over again, is in trouble. And while there have been, of course, organizations concerned about rape and violence for a long time, a renewed impetus for all of these concerns has been triggered by many of the attacks during the mobilizations. Again, we've heard all of this. It's really important. Blue Bra Girl was mentioned. Harris Map, again, these are things that I've written. One interesting example of, I think, a very interesting and a campaign that's had some impact is, I'm going to move a little bit outside the Arab world to Iran, where in 2014 there was a spate of acid attacks against women, particularly on the streets of Isfahan. That triggered lots of demonstrations on the street, men and women, who were often mobilized, of course, through text messaging. That's the other argument, is how have the online demonstrations and mobilizations been developed? Clearly, tweeting and messaging and all of these social media are really important in mobilizing people. In terms of online activity, May 2014, my Stealthy Freedom campaign, look it up on Facebook, attracted hundreds of thousands of Iranian women who were taking photographs of themselves unveiled. And to all the people, women and non-women, saying, the veil, why is that important? Masih Ali-Nejad, who's the London-based journalist who established the campaign, has argued very nicely about the employment of security people, the material investment in monitoring women's maintenance of hijab. So she's saying it's not just a symbolic issue, and it's not just, please be faithful to our particular version of a cultural a cultural space, it has a huge materiality of bodies and of cost to maintain this securitization. So it's a very interesting campaign. She just won an international prize in New York. So again, there's an interesting and not often problematic recognition of some of this activity at international levels. Yeah? Okay. 2 sentences about each of my points. Fifth, women are, of course, asking questions about gendered roles, about sexual identities that challenge older patriarchal cultures and the habitus and practices that limit not only women's but men's sexuality. They're breaking social taboos, they're raising new issues, they're showing the engendered power of patriarchal values. My example here was the online feminist movement in Syria called Al-Awsat. She has awoken, producing very interesting material about Syrian patriarchy that keep women marginalized by default. There are many more examples. Sixth, final point here, and then I'll conclude with 2 sentences. If women are harassed in the flesh in material space, sadly, of course, the online environment doesn't offer a completely safe space. And here again, women in the region are no different from women elsewhere who are being trolled and harassed horribly in the online environment. And of course, we've also had examples already at the conference about ISIS and other groups using the online environment to foster their particular ideology. So it's not all positive. If there's government control, last point, or quick couple of points, there's clearly the other, if there's a trifecta of state power, corporate power, and citizenry, corporate power in the sense of the platforms, the surveillance, the development of our data, selling of our data to corporations, also matters. So if I end up also a bit echoing Aline, toward the positive, we also, I think, if we're going to encourage more women, and as women themselves are getting online, getting mobile phones, getting access, and becoming active, we also, and ourselves included, need to be very concerned about our security position, our privacy. We need a lot of training in this. So I absolutely do not want to be heard as a super optimist. On the other hand, I do think it's a really interesting new space and new politics is possible. Thank you.
That whatever I'm going to share with you today is mainly based on my experiences in Afghanistan, and I will talk, although I know it's more about the Middle East than the Arab world, but I will talk more with reference to Afghanistan because that's where I come from and I know the situation. And the second point is that I might not seem very optimistic when it comes to online women's activism. And it also has a lot to do with where I come from, and that's Afghanistan, and I know that most of you will know how the situation has been there for women in the last, let's say, 35 years or more. I would like to talk about women's online activism in Afghanistan mainly, but before that, let me say that while I personally agree with many scholars and those who argue for the usefulness or for how vital these technologies, including the internet and the whole information and communication technologies, are for the society, and how the society, according to some scholars, these technologies have changed an industrial age into information age and has revolutionized the society and economy and polity. But at the same time, we must also talk about some very basic issues, maybe not basic, but very important issues that how, despite of all those vitalness and those benefits of the information technology, and especially the internet, what are the issues and problems and challenges that women especially face in all around the world, but especially in third world countries, including Afghanistan and the Middle East. We all know that access to communication technologies and internet is not easy for majority of women especially, and that means that disparities exist widely everywhere, especially in our countries. But what's important is that why these disparities or why these inequalities exist. I'm not going to talk more about these because I know all of you understand better than me. But again, based on the experiences, there are in the arguments that have been made, especially in conservative societies like Afghanistan, that not only cultural constraints and traditions and patriarchy has a role to play in this lack of access or limited access to the information technologies, but also there are other very basic issues, including the infrastructure, for example, the access to like the language or media training or training about the technology, how to use them. So these are issues that make women especially very, limit their access to the digital world. I know that Annabelle and also Aline talk about the online activism in the Middle East, but also I'm not going to ignore the fact that how vital it was during the Arab Spring, and most of us, myself also, have been following all the issues through the internet and Facebook and everything. But at the same time, as Lubna Sakli says, that despite the achievements and despite whatever women in the Middle East have Okay. So it's the public sphere still remains or is the self-acclaimed space of male absolute power and dominance until relatively recently. And also, again, she is very helpful to say that the access and use of the internet in the Middle East and North Africa are clearly defined by gender, age, class, and regional differences. So that's why it's not surprising that in the Arab world there are only 1/3 of women who have access of the population in the region who have access to the internet. And the reasons, again, according to, for example, Arab social media report, it's the cultural and the social constraints, but according to some others, it's also the social media literacy and access to technology. These are very important issues. Now, Afghanistan. I think Afghanistan, when we talk about media or information technologies, is a very important case for those who are interested in this topic in two senses. Because first, after Afghanistan, after 9/11, is an Afghanistan with a media boom, including the internet. Afghanistan, where under the Taliban, the TV was banned. There was no TV. There was no radio, only one, which was a radio station controlled by the Taliban. all of a sudden Afghanistan became a media-centric country, and there exist now more than 100 TV channels and hundreds of radios channels, magazines, newspapers, and all of such media tools. But the important thing about Afghanistan is that what these technology had for women, or what they had offered, or whether women had access to these technologies. I would like to quote Natasha Primo, who says that where there is no access to education, healthcare, proper accommodation, enough food, electricity, road, transport, credit, and most importantly, physical and mental security, access to and use of information technology will be limited in its impact. And that's exactly the case in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a country with only 28% literacy rate, and out of it, 12% are women who can barely read and write. The cultural and the tradition aspect of it is very obvious how these constraints have played a role. For example, last year, early March, I had a project related to media, and I interviewed some young women, age 18 to 25 maybe, and from the 30 young women who had mobiles, of course, mobile phones, only 5 had access to internet, and when I asked what was the reason behind it, it was not only lack of course, the income issues and the financial issues, but also the cultural and the patriarchal dominance in the families, that they will not allow girls, especially young girls, to have access to internet. And this, I think, also tell us the fact that not only there exist these constraints, but also lack of awareness about these technologies, because throughout the last 30 years or more, when the religious fundamentalists are dominant in Afghanistan, they have been propagating about the technologies as being all satanic devices and tools which will corrupt society, and especially the women, and therefore women should not have access to these. So there is a need to awareness or information or media literacy as well. One important point, which may not be related so much to media and all that, but I would like to talk about the religious fundamentalism and the danger and the threats, the serious threats that has brought and will brought, unfortunately, because I have been hearing and following the progress or the growth of these fundamentalist movements, the religious movements in different parts of the Middle East, especially in the Arab world, and also in Afghanistan. For example, so far the Afghan women were faced with the jihadis or the mujahideen or the warlords, and then the Taliban. But now there are news, unfortunately, of the ISIS is progressing in Afghanistan. And it's also important to note or talk about this fact as well, that the fundamentalists, the fight between the so-called fight between the religious fundamentalists and the Americans or the imperialists is just it's a hypocrisy, I would say. It is not really, it is to deceive the people, at least I can say for Afghanistan. And that's why this threat is, it's very serious threat, and we activists or those who are concerned about the women's issues and rights must divert their attention to this threat as well. Despite all these problems, of course, women, like in any other fields and during the history, and they have fought against injustices and inequalities, and in the same as, of course, they have been fighting back this digital divide or these disparities. Women have used, as long as and to what extent these technologies have been available in Afghanistan or elsewhere, they have been trying to use them. And I'm not going to talk why, because we know that they, for organizational purposes, to organize themselves for image building, to give information, and for all, for their empowerment, of course, for fundraising, and if we talk about the NGOs and the civil society. So it helped them a lot. And we know the very famous case of Zapatistas from Chiapas, how internet turned into a worldwide scene. And I just would like, I don't know if I have time. 3 minutes. Okay. The case of RAWA, an organization that I work with for many years. RAWA is the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan. It was established in 1977, and it was and still is, in fact, an underground organization due to its secular, anti-fundamentalist, and democratic in fight for democracy. So RAWA had to go underground. And that's why the fight for women's rights and women's emancipation was not easy. RAWA had to find establish different strategies and different ways in order to be able to continue its fight. But with the internet, RAWA says that when we in fact found out about, so internet became a field of activism for RAWA in particular, an underground organization that was not known. It became a known organization internationally. And I must say that thanks to the internet, that Afghan women found dedicated and very hardworking and kind supporters like Carol Mann sitting here in front of me. So definitely the internet for RAWA, I don't have much time, but it was a tool. It was something that introduced RAWA to the international audience or to the international people, and as a result, the solidarity in working together with a lot of organizations, different groups, support groups were established from Italy to Spain to Canada to Japan to everywhere. And RAWA members are invited in different conferences, and they informed. What I mean by this is that as a result of this, RAWA, through RAWA's work and through RAWA's access to outside world, it was able to build a different image also for the Afghan women, not anymore burqa-clad women. Now Afghan women were with a voice, with their own voice. And that's really was very important in this whole, to use this internet and these technologies. But at the same time, just to conclude, is that about the problems and the issues that women face online, especially activists, for being activists and for being women. Already it has been talked a lot, like online harassment. Ideally, not myself, but I know friends and those women from Afghanistan who, how they have been harassed online and how they have been defamed and how they were made to come again online, apologize to what happened or how others use their pictures, for example, photos and everything. So, and the other important point is that despite the fact that it's very, very important to be active online and to use all these technologies, but we must also remember that online activism may not translate into reality as it should. And therefore, we need to find different ways, and as happened with the Zapatista, for example, that a very known group internationally through internet, but they were not able to sustain that, and they went back to their communities and had to find a social base for themselves within the community. And the same can be true about Rawa as well, though internationally known organization with a voice, but inside Afghanistan, unfortunately, it was isolated from the masses. So if we want to have a really meaningful and measurable change in this regard, I think we have a long way and very hard fight to go, because our enemies, I don't know how to define the enemies, but I would say in the case of Afghanistan, from the invaders to the religious fundamentalists and to patriarchy and everyone, I think they could not be simply tweeted away or Facebooked. We need a very long and strong fight in order to be able to have access and equal rights and emancipation, both online and offline. Thank you.
I today will be talking about the 1%. These are the few but significant Syrian women who have become role models for 10 million girls and women whom we should support to ensure that gains they have made during the past few years are not just sustainable but part of the agenda, no matter the result of the military or political conflict. I'm conducting a series of studies, and they look at the impact of different factors on change and change of dominance of patriarchy in Syria. So there are various factors, and they include displacement, education, and work. We've written, as journalists, and read a lot about the extreme losses associated with the displacement, education, and work for Syrians in recent years, about how half the population of Syria, 10 million people, have been ripped apart and lost their livelihoods due to displacement, the worst humanitarian crisis in recent history, about how Syrian children have lost their youth and potential due to a lack of education, hundreds of thousands now out of formal education, and how thousands of Syrian families now live in extreme poverty due to a lack of opportunities for fairly paid work. We can, however, within the context of the same three factors of change, witness opportunities that may impact the lives and attitudes of Syrian women, and in the long term, perhaps chip away at the patriarchal foundations on which Syria's society, law, and economy have been based. Displacement, harsh as it is, has exposed Syrian women to other cultures and societies, some in other parts of the country, some in host refugee countries. For the most part, women did not move freely within Syria. People did not congregate freely in general. Large gatherings were monitored and often declared illegal. As such, the exposure women have had interacting with each other, Syrians from towns they hadn't visited before, interacting with foreigners in host communities, has provided opportunities for exchanges in experiences and thoughts and expanded horizons, both figuratively and literally. Opportunities to consume media, which before had been censored and mostly state-run, to engage in dialogue or to train together, have expanded the skill sets of many Syrian women. Their awareness of a multitude of issues and the different opinions held about those issues has been heightened through various activist and professional media outlets, shining a spotlight on issues that matter to Syrian women, be it child marriage, custody, political participation, rights in the workplace. The list is endless. With many men at war or unemployed, many Syrian women have become entrepreneurial and breadwinners, often encouraged by civil society initiatives. They have discovered in themselves abilities and strengths they did not know they had, and they have been rewarded based on hard work, not corruption or favoritism. They have worked in fields across the board: catering, embroidery, medical assistance, media. I'm running a series of studies, as I mentioned, on the relationship between these enforced factors of change they did not seek, and developments in female empowerment among Syrian women. I am motivated first and foremost by a desire to contribute to securing the gains Syrian women have made. Yes, the situation in Syria is bleak, but we can seize the opportunity to identify and nurture the gains made by women during this time of transition, when the norms of society made way for some advancement. You may not yet see these gains in legislation or governance, but if we don't hold on to them and nurture them now, before the warmongering men draw up a plan that disregards and discards women, then we will return to the sidelines, embittered, having tasted empowerment only to have it ripped from our hands. I say our because I'm Syrian, but I do not reflect the Syrian women of whom I speak because I grew up in Europe. So I've been speaking to them, Syrian women, gathering their thoughts and experiences through surveys and interviews. In keeping with the focus of this panel, I will highlight the journalists I have interviewed: Zena, Razan, Hiba, Lubna. They are part of the 1%, the small but significant minority of Syrian women whose gains we must nurture and replicate in order to entrench their ability and desire to ensure women's empowerment continues no matter what the future holds for Syria. A war was waged, and within that war, many women found their voice and opportunities to become equal citizens in a country with no rights. As we work towards the development of a rights-based country, the voices of women must remain loud. Working in the media promotes a sense of ownership and empowerment. So it's no surprise that these women, these journalists, also engaged heavily in women's empowerment. Lubna has spent the past 18 months presenting a research-based radio program in Arabic that details and discusses all international conventions and Syrian laws that pertain to issues that affect women. Zena has launched a blog publishing writings by women she has trained in media, providing them with an outlet for expression but also an income, which she says stopped the men from complaining about their wives' activities. Hiba has worked with women in various towns and neighborhoods in Syria on constitutional reform. I run an NGO, so research for me is directly related to access assessment. The result of analyses of research should ideally be able to inform program development. As such, I categorize findings based on potential programmatic themes, concepts, knowledge we can design initiatives around so we create a multiplier effect and get more women on the train to empowerment. A number of themes and factors that can inform effective program development have been identified. They include a sense of purpose, parental support, camaraderie, and role models. I enjoyed all of them growing up in London, but the last one, role models, was an interesting one for me to look into. I couldn't recall any female role models growing up, my mother excluded, of course. But the truth is there were so many of them that I didn't consciously identify any. At the age of 12, my aspiration, truly, was to be president of an Arab country, and I didn't think that there would be anything to stop me. It was a very genuine aspiration. But I grew up with Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister, a woman. So I didn't consciously have to pick out a role model. They were all around. Say what you will about her politics. She was a woman and I was young. But in the interest of time today, I will expand on the first two factors, a sense of purpose and parental support. And I will draw from the experience of the female journalists, none of whom, it should be mentioned, were journalists before the revolution. They may have been studying media-related topics, but their actual experience came during the tough times of the conflict. And within the conflict, through the conflict, they found their voice and gave voice to others. For them and for Syrian women, the conflict has been a double revolution, a change of regime and a change of women's role in society. Hiba had wanted to leave Syria before the revolution, since she was a child, in fact, but the revolution changed that. She says, "During the revolution, I felt connected to Syria. I wasn't scared. I didn't die when Nusra shot at me, but something did. I could understand dying at the hands of the regime, the enemy, but that day, I had to reevaluate everything." She left Gaziantep in southern Turkey the next morning after being shot at by Nusra. Despite having to leave Syria, her sense of purpose hasn't faded. While the regime remains her number one enemy, so too do the fundamentalists who seek to subdue her. She says, "We are now fighting patriarchy and religious fundamentalists whose first fight is against women." We've heard that quite a lot the past 3 days. She fights from Gaziantep by training Syrian women, women in Syria, and advocating online for various issues, highlighting the abuses suffered by women in the country. Razan was born to a Syrian mother and a Palestinian father in the US and spent the first 10 years of her life in Saudi Arabia. So she doesn't identify herself as Syrian or Arab, but rather, eschewing labels, she regards herself as of the region. The revolution changed that for a while, she says. "The one thing that made me feel I belonged to Syria was the revolution. It was extraordinary. The revolution made me feel I can be part of it and belong now. I felt a kinship then. I know it's romanticizing, but I felt that I could change my future and reality by being part of it. I was scared, but it was worth it." Middle class, educated, and with a foreign nationality, Razan had many options, but her sense of purpose kept her in Syria. She was arrested many times and in 2013 went to the small town of Kafr Nabal in the liberated areas. Many of you will know that from the slogans, the weekly creative slogans that gained international attention there. Razan went alone, and she worked on a psychosocial project, support project for children. She stayed for a year, but then she went to Turkey. She said the sense of loneliness was too palpable to bear any longer. And that expanded with other testimonies into the concept of camaraderie being an important factor motivating people. Zena, she continues to live and work in Syria. With fluent English and a master's degree, she gained a job with the BBC in London at the beginning of the revolution. And then she left and went back to Syria. Her purpose, she says, "I would hate war reporting if it wasn't my own country, but it's best to live the fear you're reporting. Media is my tool, it is what I am, but women are my passion, and I can best reach the women from inside. The women I am working with, I am their only chance." Try as I might to understand what it is that enabled 3 young, beautiful, educated, employable women to live under daily threat of war, or rather war and daily threat of death, I couldn't. Their sense of purpose was simply stronger than any fear that could stop them. What did become clear, however, is that their sense of purpose is strengthened by camaraderie. As such, programs that bring people together and work towards singular and common goals are ultimately more successful and sustainable than disparate teams with a multitude of objectives. Parental support, another one of the factors identified. Lubna grew up in the Nawak, a conservative town halfway between Damascus and Homs. Her uncles were school teachers who didn't allow their daughters to go to university. Lubna's father barely graduated school, but he allowed his daughters to go to university, even though it meant leaving the family home and living with a group of girls in Damascus. She says, "I don't have any brothers. I think that was definitely part of the reason we were encouraged to pursue our education." Her uncle did have sons. "Because my father wanted to ensure we could take care of ourselves. He was also more social, more traveled than my uncles." After 2 of her friends were arrested, however, Lubna moved to Cairo to continue her studies. But she had to leave in the summer of 2013, and she went to Saudi, where her father worked, and she had a residency, so she too had options. But she needed to be back in Damascus, and she needed to be active, and her father supported that. I know this sounds wrong, but he allowed that, and that is quite something. Now, back in Damascus, continuing her studies, she presents a radio program about women's rights and is very positive about the future of women in Syria. She says, "Now, most homes are run by women. The great strength that came out of the Syrian women during the revolution was amazing. If you taste something great, you won't lose it. Even the uneducated discovered things very important in them and a great strength. They won't lose what they have discovered. I hope she's right. Only the second girl from her village to go to university, Hiba also left her conservative hometown in Idlib province to live with other women in Aleppo and Raqqa, where she was an instructor at the city's universities. By the time she left Idlib, she had divorced her husband of 1 month. My parents simply told me that I had to take responsibility for my decisions. My struggle was with society and not my small family. When I started demanding women's rights, some people started to ruin my reputation, using the fact that I was divorced to sully my reputation and suggest that I was a loose woman. Society sees women moving forward and they want to beat her down. I didn't care. Zina's mother was her champion when it came to her leaving Idlib to study journalism at Damascus University. My mother struggled with bad-mouthing. But after the revolution, when I started writing about Idlib, those who mocked me at that time started appreciating me and calling me with stories. Instead of being ashamed, they were proud. Even Zina's maternal aunt, who was against her going to Damascus, ultimately appreciated Zina's achievement because she now financially depends on her. And she says she is proud and thankful that her niece did not listen to her. There is no doubt that struggling against the conservative norms of society is much more difficult, if not impossible, without the support of one's parents. It's therefore essential to reinforce to parents of young children the importance of women's contributions to the survival of Syrian families and society during this war. When they see how valuable, vital, and equally capable women are of supporting themselves and their families if given the opportunity, parents may begin to offer at least the same, if not more, opportunities for education and growth to their daughters as they do their sons. The conclusion is straightforward. There is opportunity in every disaster, and many Syrian women have embraced that through both a shift in attitudes and financial empowerment. We must embrace them and support them so they may replicate individual successes, but also move beyond the individual and begin working from the perspective of an unbreakable national agenda. Thank you.